If he had just given us the money, none of this would have happened. Actually, what Van Brett Watkins said was, it was Ray's fault if he had just given us money. None of this would have happened. Those two sentences, it was Ray's fault if he had just given us the money, none of this would have happened, summarize the truth about what occurred on the evening of November 15th and the early morning hours of November 16th of 1999. Because this isn't a reference to a contract killing. This isn't a reference to a hit. These words, which Van Brett Watkins said to a deputy sheriff, a sworn law enforcement officer in Mecklenburg County, in December of 1999, before Sharika Adams ever died, before this was a murder case, before he was facing the death penalty, before he was making any deals for himself. Those words refer to the fact that Rae Carruth had refused to give them the money for a drug deal that Watkins was arranging with Michael Kennedy. That's what those words relate to. Because the truth of this case, and after all, we are here for the truth of this case is that the shooting of Sharika Adams on November 16th, 1999, had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that she was pregnant. The shooting of Sharika Adams on November 16th of 1999 had absolutely nothing to do with how Rae Carruth felt about having another baby. The shooting of Sharika Adams on November 16th, 1999 was the result of anger and rage and violence by Van Brett Watkins after Carruth refused to give them the money. And you will hear evidence during the course of this trial, members of the jury, that anger and rage and violence has been with Van Brett Watkins for years and years and years. And you will hear evidence that he has acted on that rage time and time again in irrational ways. And that is precisely what happened on November the 16th of 1999. Now, you've heard a lot in the media and during voir dire and some in opening statement about the relationship between Rae Carruth and Sharika Adams. And the media, I must confess, has sometimes sort of focused in unfairly on certain aspects of her life that have nothing to do with this. And they referred to her as Rae Carruth's girlfriend, which I think in common parlance sort of implies that there's an ongoing, committed sort of relationship. And some of you may have gotten that impression from reading the newspaper. Well, you probably won't be surprised to learn that that's not true. What was in the newspaper about that is not true. What is the truth about their relationship? Let me tell you a little bit about that. They met in May of 1988 at a cookout at a Panthers house. kind of cookouts that we all go to. And what she was doing at that time was working in the real estate business, that's all. And they talked, and they exchanged numbers, as people their age do. And they saw each other 3 or 4 times in May and June of 1998. And then they each went their separate ways. There was no sexual relationship between them at that point. And Rae went his way, and Sharika went her way. And they each were dating other people. They had no contact with each other from June of 1998 until April of 1999. Early April of 1999, Rae took a friend of his, Luther Brockman, to a club. And there was Sharika. And she recognized him before he recognized her, and they started talking. And they once again exchanged numbers, and they once again saw each other 3 or 4 times, only this time there was a sexual relationship. It wasn't a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship. It wasn't a monogamous relationship. They dated each other several times. That was the relationship that existed up until May of 1999. That was it. And Rae had similar relationships with other women. He did not hide the fact from one woman that he was going out with another woman. They could accept it or not, but he certainly didn't hide it. In early May, Rae was in Dallas visiting a friend, and he got a phone call from Sharika. And what Sharika told him in that phone call was that her period was late and that she thought she might be pregnant. She had taken a couple of home pregnancy tests, and the results, I think, were not altogether consistent. Now, what Rae Carruth did at that point was not what a lot of people would have done, which is, call me when you find out for sure and we'll talk about it. I'm in Dallas and, go to the doctor and let me know. No. Rae Carruth flew home from Dallas, and he went to the OBGYN appointment with Sharika to determine whether she was pregnant or not. Because that's who he is. And when he went to the doctor and found out for sure that she was pregnant, yes, there was a discussion about an abortion. And any of you who are opposed to abortion, hopefully you won't hold that against us. But there was. I think most people that age in that circumstance would have had a similar discussion. But Sharika, because of experiences in her past, didn't want to have an abortion. And Rae respected that. And what Rae did, again, was not what a lot of young men in his position would have done. It wasn't what our stereotype of a young professional football player would have done. What he did was he participated in the pregnancy. He went to OBGYN appointments with Sharika. Dr. Bell, the doctor, will confirm that. He went and bought baby furniture, a playpen, and dressers for his house that are still in storage today. And we will show you those. He went with Sharika to buy baby things. They talked about names and even went so far as to pick out a girl's name and weren't able to agree on a boy's name, although Sharika liked Chancellor from the start. Rae didn't. He gave her money for child-related expenses, including things like supplements for her to take in terms of her personal health. Indeed, you will see a check that he wrote to her on October the 18th of 1999, less than a month before this shooting, for $1,260. $260 of which was to help pay for a crib, and the other $1,000 was to help pay for her rent and incidental expenses. 1 month, less than 1 month before. But most importantly, because money is just money, most importantly, they agreed to co-parent this baby. They weren't going to get married. There was never any talk of getting married. Rae didn't make any pretense with Sharika that he wanted to get married, and Sharika didn't make any pretense back. And they had some rocky times in terms of Sharika sometimes wanting Rae to be more involved with her, although she really didn't have any complaints about his fathering or prospective fathering. And Rae was busy with other people, and some of you may dislike that, and I understand that. But that was the nature of the relationship. What they had agreed upon was that they would try as best they could to be friends. They were going to have this baby together. She was planning on moving closer to where he lived in South Charlotte. She had taken steps in that regard. And they were going to raise this baby together. And that was what the intent was. Now, it's important for you all to realize that never once during this 7.5 months from early May up until November did Rae Carruth ever take the position with Sharika Adams that, well, that's not my baby. Until you prove it's my baby, it's not my baby. And there's lots of people who would have done that. Rae Carruth's approach was the exact opposite. He assumed it was his baby until somebody showed him differently. And he therefore acted accordingly. Now, why? Why did he take that approach? Well, Rae had real regrets about the way he had fathered his first child, Rae Jr., born while he was at the University of Colorado to his high school sweetheart. He had to be on the phone from practice when she went into labor and delivered. He couldn't be there. He missed the first tooth, and he missed the first step, and he missed all the firsts. And he was troubled by the fact that his relationship with his son was not as close as he would have liked it to be. And so he was determined that he was going to do it differently this time. Sharika was here, the baby would be here, and he could do it the way he wanted to do it. He could be the kind of father that he wanted to be. And that's what he set out to do. And by the way, he discussed that with other people. You'll hear witnesses come in here and talk about the fact that he had those kinds of discussions. Indeed, he had a discussion like that with Miss Adams on the night that Sharika was shot at the hospital when he went up to see the baby. And so his intention on November the 15th, members of the jury, was to be the best father he could be to the baby that he was hoping was going to be born on his birthday, January 20th, because her due date was January 16th, and they had talked about that. And it was Van Brett Watkins, in his rage and irrationality and anger, who put an end to that dream on November 16th, not Rae Carruth. Now, let me talk with you a little bit about Van Brett Watkins. Who is this person? You've heard about him. You've read about him. Who is he? Well, Van Brett Watkins has a long history of criminal behavior, of criminal convictions, felony convictions. He has a long history of violence, and he has a long history of rage particularly against women. For example, in 1983, when Rae Carruth was in elementary school in Abilene, Texas, playing Pop Warner football, Watkins was in a New York State prison, Clinton, maximum security, for assault and possession of a gun. And the evidence will show that in that situation, eerily enough, he had taken a gun and shot it off in a residential neighborhood and had shot a passerby. And then, when he was arrested for it, tried to put the blame on other people. That's what the facts are with regard to that conviction. And he went upstate in New York to serve that sentence. And then in 1989, when Rae Carruth is entering high school, and he's playing football, and he's running track, and he's playing basketball, and he hasn't been in one day of trouble in his life. Growing up in the hood, but not one day of trouble in his life. What's Van Brett Watkins doing? He's back in prison on a parole violation for a new assault and an armed robbery where he pistol whipped somebody. Pistol whipped him. And then when the police tried to arrest him, he went up on a roof, broke glass out of a window, pulled the casement out, and from 4 floors up was throwing huge sheets of glass and the casements down on passerbys and the police for 4 hours. That's what the evidence will be about the 1989 incident. 1997, let's move ahead. Rae Carruth now is in college at the University of Colorado. He's going to classes. He's maintaining his grades. He's an All-American in football, and he's running track. And once again, he has not been in one day of trouble in his life. Nothing. Never. And what is Van Brett Watkins doing? Van Brett Watkins is pleading guilty to menacing Brenda Watkins. And the facts of that will show that what he did was to take a meat cleaver and hold it to her face and force her out of her own apartment and into his car. That he then took that car and drove it the wrong way on a major highway in New York. For those of you who've lived up there, the Belt Highway, the Belt Parkway, in New York. The wrong way. And then he drove back to her apartment, barricaded her and him in the apartment, and threatened to kill her. That's what he did in 1997. And I'm not going to spend all my time going through the rest of it because you'll hear it. That is just a preview, a glimpse at the man who the state has made a deal with to testify against Rae Carruth to avoid the death penalty. And you'll hear much more about him. Now, as you sit there, if I was in your situation, a legitimate question would be, well, what was Rae Carruth doing with someone like that? I mean, what's he doing with him? And in retrospect, Mr. Carruth has certainly asked himself that question many times. So let me explain to you how that happened. In June of 1999, Rae had just bought a house in South Charlotte. And he wanted to build a fence for a dog in the backyard. And he got a couple of quotes, and Sharif Foster, his realtor, said she knew somebody, some guy named New York, who had a construction company, not a big construction company, a handyman sort of thing. And he had done some work for her and some other people, and he could probably build a fence. And that was in June of 1999. Sharika was already pregnant. And he came over and gave Rae a quote for offense. And for the next 3 or 4 months, he was in and out of town. And you'll hear a little bit more about why that is later on. But he really wasn't around. And I think what you'll hear evidence is that Rae may have had some contact with him in July. There was a phone call. Then the next phone call, I think, from Rae to him is sometime in October. I mean, this is not anything that's a day-to-day situation. And what he basically would do is he would come over and he would detail Rae's cars and he would clean up around the yard. Take away, by when Rae moved, he had a bunch of boxes that he never cleared out. Subsequently, Mr. Watkins took those away. Those sorts of jobs, handyman sorts of jobs. And that was the extent of their relationship until November 1st of 1999. And that's an important date for you all to keep in mind, November 1st of 1999. Because on that date, Watkins was over at Carruth's house, cleaning out the garage and cleaning up the yard. And while he was there, Michael Kennedy, along with Stanley Abraham, came by. Now let me just pause for a second and tell you a little bit about Kennedy and Abraham. And let me just for a second put that date up here since it is an important date. Kennedy and Abraham came by. He had met Kennedy, Rae had, back in February of 1999, so about 9 months earlier, at a car shop here in Charlotte. He was there buying rims for his car. Kennedy was there buying rims for his car. They were about the same age, and they started talking. Kennedy was from Charlotte. He knew the music scene in Charlotte. He knew the black community in Charlotte. Rae really didn't, because he hadn't stayed here during his off seasons. He liked music, Rae liked music. He liked cars, Rae liked cars. They struck up a friendship of sorts. And Kennedy would call him up and come by his house, and they weren't buddies in the sense that they didn't go out clubbing together, but they spent time together. And Abraham, who the prosecutor really didn't talk about, we didn't hear much about what his role was supposed to be in this contract, he was just a friend of Kennedy's, and Rae had met him through Kennedy. And the two of them were sort of aspiring rappers, and I don't know a whole lot about rap music, but they had made a demo tape. And Rae had a friend from college who was in the music business in California, and they wanted Rae to send this demo tape to that person. And so they came over that day with the tape. Critical day. Because while they were over, Mr. Watkins, at one point that afternoon, took out a duffel bag, a military duffel bag, from the back of his U-Haul. He opened it up, and he took out what he called a brick of marijuana, a chunk of it. And he showed it to Kennedy and Carruth. And he told them that that was spoken for, but if they wanted any in the future, there was more where that came from in Atlanta. And there wasn't anything else said about it, because at that point, no one expressed any interest. Over the next 8 or 9 days, until about November 10th of 1999, Michael Kennedy contacted Mr. Carruth several times and indicated he wanted Mr. Carruth to follow up with Mr. Watkins. He didn't know Watkins. Carruth knew Watkins. Watkins didn't know Kennedy. Watkins knew Carruth. And so several times during this time period, Kennedy asked Carruth to follow up, and Carruth didn't. But finally, I think it was on the 9th, he makes a phone call, and on the 10th of November, another important date, he meets with Watkins. There's another guy there. He doesn't want to talk in front of him about this. So they go into Rae's car, and they have a discussion about what Kennedy wants to do with regard to buying this marijuana. And Carruth indicates that Kennedy has asked him about lending him the money, and Carruth is probably going to lend him the money. Now, they have a discussion on that date, and then you will see from the phone records that that's a Wednesday. This is a Monday. And the reason that was happening on Monday night was because the Panthers have Tuesdays off. Monday night's sort of like their Saturday night or Friday night. This was a Wednesday. And then on Thursday and Friday, which would have been November 11th and 12th, you will see in the phone records, we'll bring them in, a number of telephone calls between Rae and Kennedy, between Kennedy and Rae, between Watkins and Rae, between Rae and Watkins, discussing this marijuana business. On Saturday, we're now November 13th, the Panthers are going to St. Louis to play the Rams. And Watkins calls Rae, and the way Watkins would get in touch with Rae is Watkins didn't have a cell phone. He would page Rae, and then Rae would have to page him back, or call him back, one or the other. And he got in touch with Rae, and he told Rae that he was all set to go to Atlanta to pick up these drugs, this marijuana, and he needed the money because his source wasn't going to give him it on credit. And Rae was not about to give Watkins thousands of dollars. And he told Watkins he was going out of town, he was going to the game, and that this could wait. I mean, there was no hurry to this from Rae's perspective, and they could just talk about it when he got back. And that's where he thought it had been left on Saturday, November 13th. Sunday, November 14th, the Panthers played in St. Louis. Watkins paged Rae, and Rae called him back. Now, no calls from Rae to Kennedy on either Saturday or Sunday, none. To the driver, the setting up the hit, no calls to the driver. Last call to Kennedy is about 7:30 p.m. on Friday night. Watkins, he calls back, and now Watkins says he's gone down to Atlanta. And because he told this person that Rae Carruth, the football player, was going to be funding this, the guy had agreed to provide the marijuana on credit. But he needed to get this deal done because he needed to get the money back. Now, Carruth was in St. Louis at the time. And what Rae said to him was, look, first of all, I really don't appreciate that you're telling people that this is my money. And second of all, I haven't talked with Kennedy since Friday. For all I know, he's changed his mind. And what did you need to go and get this for? There was no rush. And I can't do anything tonight because when I get back, I'm going to a club, and we'll deal with this tomorrow. And he got off the phone, and he went back after the game to Charlotte, and that night, again, Watkins pages him. And he calls Watkins back. Now it's like 12:30 in the morning. He's at a club, and Watkins is saying, we need to do this deal tomorrow. And even then, he had not yet gotten up with Kennedy. And he told Watkins that. And Watkins was getting angry and frustrated. And that brings us to Monday, November 15th, 1999. The the day that ended up with Sharika Adams being shot. Early that morning, despite the late night call, early that morning, Watkins pages him again. Carruth calls him back at about 9:54, and Watkins says, "We need to do this today." And Carruth says, "I have still not spoken to Kennedy," because he hadn't. And at this point, Watkins gets angry, and he's cursing, and he's saying that if they don't do this today, he's going to be in the deep with his supplier. And he's frustrated, and he's angry. And Rae says to him, "Fine, we can meet tonight. I'll call you after practice." And they get off the phone, and Rae goes to football practice. Now, under Mr. Caudell's theory, this is the day that he has decided that he is going to arrange for the contract murder of Sharika Adams and his own baby. That's their theory. So let's take a look at what he does on this critical day and see if it's consistent with that. Well, he goes to football practice, and he's there until about 3:45. Never once does he call Kennedy, the driver of this hit. Doesn't call him at all. Not that morning, not that afternoon. He's not spoken to the driver since Friday night at 7:30. He's at football practice. And he leaves football practice at about 3:45. I have a chart which I think will help you all follow what happens that day. If I can have just a moment. Let me get out here. Can all of you see that? Is that visible? Let's talk about the time frame that day from 4 o'clock until 9 o'clock. Practice ends at 3:45, and Rae calls Alondia Cheney in Atlanta. He then goes, he has a 15-minute phone conversation with her, and he then goes and plays video football at William Floyd's house. Now, this may be hard to believe, but the Carolina Panthers, and I take it other football teams, they organize these video football leagues among the players, and they're each assigned, it's John Madden's PlayStation football, and they have a tournament, and there's a league, and there's scheduled games, and you have to play your games within 24 hours or they're forfeited, and there's all kinds of rules. And so there was a doubleheader scheduled for William Floyd's house that day. And over at William Floyd's house playing video football is William Floyd, the starting fullback for the Panthers, Muhsin Muhammad, who at that point was not the all-pro wide receiver, but soon about to be, Leonard Wheeler, a defensive back, and Rae. And they were playing video football from 4:45 to 7:15, just before he's supposed to be having this contract killing. And there's not a single call to the driver, Kennedy, or to the shooter, Watkins. Nothing. Finally, at about 7:15, he leaves, And at around 7:30, and by the way, he hasn't spoken to Sharika this whole day, so he doesn't even know what her plans are at this point. He calls Sharika at 7:30 to find out if she wants to go to the late movie. I think they were supposed to go to the early movie, but he's at this tournament, so he calls her to see if she wants to go to the late movie. And you'll see the phone call. There's a call to Sharika's house. She says yes. He calls the cinema to find out the time, calls her back, tells her, and yes, he does ask her to come to his house. And that's going to be an important thing. As a matter of fact, according to Miss Adams, Sandra Adams, Sharika said, and listen to these words, he insisted that I come to his house. Not he insisted that he go to my house. He insisted that I go to his house. And the evidence will show that the reason he did that is because he was going to try to get this marijuana transaction done between 7:30 and 9:30 when he was going to leave for the game. And so he asked her to come up and meet him at his house. Meanwhile, between 7:30 and 8:30, there's a series of calls to and from Watkins and Kennedy. Carruth to Watkins, Carruth to Kennedy, regarding this. And Kennedy agrees to come over to his house, and Watkins agrees finally to bring the marijuana to a particular place, a dump site off Rae Road at a construction area. And Rae Road looked very differently back then than it does now. Meanwhile, at about 8 o'clock, Rae calls Melvin Billingsley, a friend of his who's a high school football coach at the time, about some computer chips for a satellite dish. And asks Billingsley to come over because he wants to get that done before he goes to the movies. At about 8 o'clock, Kennedy and Abraham arrive at Carruth's house. And about 8:25, Kennedy and Carruth go to this dumpster where they're supposed to meet Watkins. And he does not show. So at about 9 o'clock, it's starting to get near movie time, and he comes back with Kennedy to his house. And lo and behold, parked in front of his house, and if any of you know Ellington, the Ellington subdivision, it is a little subdivision with basically one street into it. And Rae lived on his cul-de-sac with his neighbors like right, 10 feet away on either side. And he would play with the neighbors' kids, and he was known in the neighborhood. And here's this U-Haul sitting there with marijuana in the back of it. And Rae went nuts. And he said to Watkins, "Get that truck out of here. You weren't supposed to bring it here. I don't want this here." And he told Kennedy that he wasn't about to lend Kennedy money to do a drug deal where this guy is bringing it to his own house. And he told Kennedy at that point, "This is over." And Watkins and he got into it. And I'm not going to tell you the words that were used. I'll let other people tell you that. But it was hot and it was heavy. And there were threats. And Rae basically said, "I don't care. This is over." And Michael Kennedy finally walked him away and said, "Look it, I'm your friend. He's got the marijuana. You're going to lend me the money. I understand why you're upset, but just think about it. You're going to the movies. Call me when you get out, and just think about it." And Rae agreed to do that. And so, at 9:20, Watkins and Kennedy left Rae Carruth's house. And at about that time, Rae was talking with Melvin Billingsley, who had come over and saw that. Here's another witness. He invites a witness over, Melvin Billingsley, who sees the hitman and the driver there at his house. Melvin Billingsley is talking to him about computer chips. What happens then? At 9:20, and this will show up on the bank records, Rae goes to the ATM to get $460 for Billingsley for these computer chips, and he sees Sharika Adams, and she drives back behind him. On his way back, he calls another woman he was seeing, Nakeesh Stewart. And Sharika sees him on the phone, and she later comments to her mother that she gets really angry when she sees Rae on the phone when she's around, because she assumes, logically, that he's probably talking with another woman. And that's nothing to be proud about, but it's just a fact. At about 9:35, and by the way, Kennedy tries to call Carruth during this time frame, but he's on the phone with Stewart. About 9:35, they leave for the movie theater, the Regal Theater, which is right near his house. They buy their tickets at 9:42. You see the ticket stubs. And they go into the theater, and at the theater, they meet up with Hannibal Navies, another teammate of his, and his date, Tanya Ferguson. Totally happenstance. They're at the same movie. They go into the movie, and they're in the movie from 9:45 up until 11:45 or 11:50 when the movie ends. That's where they are. And Sharika gets some phone calls. Rae Carruth does not make any phone calls in that whole 2-hour time frame. He does not receive any phone calls in that 2-hour time frame. The hit is supposedly being set up, but his hitmen don't have a gun. And so they are frantically paging this person, Michael Patrick. 12 times. You will see it page after page after page after page. 12 times until they finally get up with him somewhere around 10:30. Rae's sitting in the movie watching the movie. They're trying to find the gun. Rae doesn't, under their theory, Rae doesn't even know if they found a gun, but he's not bothering calling. They pick up Patrick at his girlfriend's house and drive him 20 minutes to his mother's house to get this gun. And I think there will be testimony that Patrick and Kennedy have been engaged in, shall we say, illegal activities together before. Patrick gives them a gun for $100, according to him. And they then drive back. They drop him off another 20 minutes, and then at around 11:15, they drive back into the Ellington Park area, looking for Rae Carruth's car, and it's not there. And they then go to the theater, because they knew he was going to the theater, and they find his expedition there in the parking lot. And they set up on it and wait. Meanwhile, the movie ends at 11:50. Rae calls Kennedy, tells him he hasn't changed his mind. You'll see that phone call. And he goes out, and any of you who are familiar with that shopping center, he goes out the backside, off onto Elm, not out the front onto the Rae Road side. And apparently they don't see him leave out the back, and so they're sitting there at the theater trying to figure out where he is. And you'll see Kennedy's calling him, making calls. He's calling him on his new cell phone. He's calling him on his old cell phone. There's a hit going down, but he doesn't know which number he's got with him. And that brings us to the final time frame. They're still near the theater. Kennedy's trying to call him. Carruth is at his house with Sharika Adams. He makes a call to Kennedy. He checks his voicemail. He calls Hannibal Navies. There's another call to Kennedy. Sharika at this point says it's okay to stay over. And you will see that Kennedy is paging him like crazy in this time frame. He's calling him on all different cell numbers. Sharika says it's okay to stay over. She had been going back and forth. And so Rae packs his overnight bag, which, by the way, is found by the police in his car the next morning. And they start driving down Rae Road. 12:20 to 12:26, roughly, they're driving down Rae Road. And Rae Carruth calls Alondia Cheney. You will hear evidence, she had called him probably 5 or 6 times that night, and he was returning her call. This was the first opportunity that he was by himself, and he's returning her call. And he gets on the phone, and he's on with her for about, I think it was 3 minutes and 41 seconds. And Sharika is driving behind him, and apparently again sees him on the phone. And she was already upset about that. And she pulls up, she signals, and she pulls up next to him just after they cross Rae Road and 51, Pineville Matthews Road. Still 2 lanes there for maybe, 150 feet or so until it then narrows down. She pulls up next to him and says, "Forget about it. I don't want you coming over." And they have a short discussion. And Rae Carruth leaves. And he tries to speed dial Alondia back, and instead of hitting 17, he hits 13 or vice versa. It's a new cell phone. He hears Michael Kennedy's voicemail come on, he hangs up, and he immediately calls Alondia Cheney back. And he's on the phone, and the records will show this, with Alondia Cheney from 12:27 until 12:43. And she will testify. She's, at least at the time, she was an engineer for IBM. She will testify that Ray's tone of voice was normal, the conversation was normal, his demeanor was normal. She heard no shots fired. She heard no tires screeching. It was a perfectly normal conversation in which she was basically giving him a piece of her mind about the fact that he was never around to answer the phone. Meanwhile, at 12:31:31, right in the middle of that conversation, Sharika Adams is shot, and she calls 911. Rae is over at Hannibal's house, and Hannibal will testify, and Tanya will testify, and they'll testify that he came in perfectly normal. It changed later on when he got the page, then his face changed, and then his demeanor changed when he got the page that she had been shot. But he came in the house totally normal. They played video games again, and he left the house at about 2:30 to meet a woman named Candace Smith, who you will hear about later. Meanwhile, Sharika Adams was being brought to the hospital. Now, what did Rae Carruth do when he got that page? What Rae Carruth did when he got that page was he went immediately to Carolina's Medical Center. And he found Miss Adams there. And he stayed there at Carolina's Medical Center until the police, who had issued a APB, an all points bulletin for him, realized he was there. They didn't even know he was there. And they asked him if they could search his car and search his house and take his clothes and do all that stuff, and he said yes. And so that morning he left with the police to go back to his house to take care of all that stuff. But before he left the hospital, he went up to the neonatal intensive care unit to see his son, Chancellor. And he went there with Sandra Adams. And she saw him and heard him up there. And what she will testify to, what she told the police that very day was that he wanted to be there when his son was born, and would go in and he genuinely upset when he see his son. Real tears. And he wanted a picture. His comment was, I had taken a picture earlier, and he said, well, I want my own picture. And they took a picture of Chancellor, and they gave it to Rae. And he has it to this day. And when the police came to his house that morning, he took out his picture of his son with all the wires and everything else. And just like any other new father, he said, this is my son. He was born this morning. He accepted responsibility for Chancellor from the moment he laid eyes on him and never once tried to say that he wasn't responsible, because that's the kind of person that Rae Carruth is. Now, let's talk about the 911 call. Mr. Cardell was very emotional and very dramatic and gave a wonderful opening about that, about Alice Walker. Powerful, emotionally powerful. And I can't cross-examine a 911 tape. Can't do it. I can't cross-examine hospital notes. I can't try to ascertain what the specific meaning was of a specific word on the tape or in the notes, or what information it was based on or not based on. I can't probe for my client or for any of you how accurate Sharika Adams' memory, how accurate her statements were at the time that she made them. I don't dispute that she was trying to tell the truth. Let's be clear about that. I don't dispute that for 1 minute. The issue is, what was she able to do? And all I can do in that regard, it's been said that cross-examination is the greatest engine for truth ever discovered, and I can't use it here. So all I can do is put it in context. For example, during the 911 call, it is not Sharika Adams who first suggests that Rae Carruth was somehow involved in this because he was in front of her on Ray Road. No, it's the 911 dispatcher who makes the first suggestion about that. Medic, okay, how did this happen? Caller, I was following my baby's daddy, Rae Carruth, the football player. Medic, so you think he did it? First words out of his mouth. Not Sharika Adams saying she thought he did it. Medic saying. And let's think for a second, what will the evidence show about where was Sharika Adams' mind at the time this 911 call was going on? The evidence will show she was not there like she would be in a witness stand, focused on, let me think, when did he stop? When did I tell him to go on? How long after that? That's not what's going on in that car. What's going on in that car is she is scared to death, and you will hear it. She's not there trying to think to herself, all right, what's the exact sequence and how much time passed, and let me see if I can get this right. That's not what's going on. She's trying to get that medic to where she is because it's a cell phone and they can't find her. And so she's trying to give him directions. And, you'll hear things like this. You'll hear things like, just to give you a couple of examples, you'll hear things like, medic, did you see the person that shot you? Call her. I'm 8 months pregnant. She's worried about her baby. She's not worried about the person who shot her. Medic, you don't know where you're hit? Call her. I'm pulling in somebody's driveway in their yard. She's trying to survive. And it takes them 12 minutes, which will sound like an eternity to you, because it was an eternity to her, to find them. And that's what she was focused on during that time frame, not trying to get the details just exactly right. And the evidence will also show you that when we undergo extreme physical trauma, like a shooting, or like surgery, or both put together, and when we are exposed to drugs like anesthesia and sedatives like Versed, which you will hear has an effect on memory, and narcotics like morphine, given in enough dosage to keep the pain from overwhelming you. When all of that is going on, no matter how much we want to be accurate, what we say under those circumstances is simply not reliable. That's what the evidence will show. And some of you have your own experiences to draw on with regard to that. Some of you may have noticed that Mr. Caudell, despite his eloquence, spent not a single second on the topic of motive. Missing. Nothing. What's the motive here? You as jurors are entitled, as you sit there and evaluate this case, to say to yourselves, okay, why? Why would he do this? We've not heard any reason here from Mr. Caudell, but we've certainly all read in the media about child support, and he didn't want to pay child support and all that. Well, first of all, we are going to introduce evidence to you, and I told you all this in jury selection. Character evidence from people who know Rae Carruth, who have known him all his life, from all walks of his life. And those people will testify to a person that he is a friendly, easygoing, kind person. He's a jokester. You'll hear person after person refer to him as a jokester. And so the question for you all will become during this trial, what kind of motive could push someone like that, someone who's not violent or fit to go into rages like Brett Watkins, what could push someone who's easygoing and nice to hire somebody to kill Sharika Adams and his own son? What kind of motive is there? Well, let's take a look for a second at what Rae Carruth's financial situation was. On November 15th of 1999, the day of the shooting, this is a sketch, a picture of Rae Carruth's financial situation. There will be more evidence about this, but here's the sketch. On that date, the day of the shooting, his net worth, and I'm talking about net worth, including liabilities, was over $360,000. His liquid net worth, the amount he had available to him in the bank, was over $175,000, because in September of 1999, he had cashed in some investments he had made in 1998. He hadn't reinvested the money. He had paid off a bunch of his debts in late September and early October, including, by the way, a $60,000 banknote that had been used to finance a gospel concert on Mother's Day for his mother here in Charlotte. All of that had been paid off. $175,000 left in the bank. His annual salary, I asked you all not to hold this against us, $652,500. Per month, over $54,000 per month. If we take 50% tax bracket, take a little bit more. He's taking home over $25,000 per month. And what are his monthly living expenses and obligations on average? Less than $10,000 per month. And what were his prospects for the future? Well, the next year, he was to make $725,000. And then he was scheduled to be a free agent. And then he would command whatever, a starting wide receiver, because that's what he was at the time that he sprained his ankle in October. Whatever a starting wide receiver can make in the National Football League. That was his financial condition at the time. We submit to you that there is no evidence that he had a sufficient motive to give up everything he had worked his entire life for, to give up his moral values, to turn from someone who had never been in trouble a day in his life, who had never been violent towards any woman, who had never done anything to Sharika, to turn from that into a contract killer overnight? There's no motive there, we submit to you. When you think about it, the evidence will show that, at that point, he didn't even know for sure the baby was his. Why would you risk it all? If she wasn't monogamous, you can wait until the baby's born. No motive, the evidence will show. Now, Mr. Cordell predictably spoke about the trunk of the car, the arrest in Tennessee. And you've all heard about it, you all know about it, we talked about it in jury selection. What we intend to show is that sad, sort of pathetic image of him in the trunk of a car, an image that if you ever saw Kings of Comedy, you know that a number of comedians made fun of. It was so ridiculous. That image is an image not of guilt, it is an image of panic. Pure and simple panic. Because it's easy to forget, as we sit here armchairing it in 2020 hindsight, what was going on for that young man when he heard Sharika Adams had died. And by the way, the evidence will be that this was not like a planned out escape attempt or flight where, he'd gotten out of jail and he made all these arrangements and, made flight plans. No. The evidence will be that he got to the trunk of a car and Wendy Cole started driving wherever she was going. What was the situation that existed at that point? Let's think back for a second. What the evidence will show is that he was a young man who was living not around family and close friends, but across the country from family and close friends. For 30 days, he had been living with whether or not his son was going to live or die, whether or not Sharika Adams was going to live or die, every moment of every day. For 30 days, he had been living with the publicity that all of you read. I mean, imagine if you were the object of it, not just reading it. Seeing computer graphics showing, your car supposedly stopping her. And reading how you're the mastermind. And reading how, she's your girlfriend when you know that it was a different relationship. And he's seeing all of that every single day. And he's feeling the way most people felt, that he had been convicted in the media from the get-go. I mean, that's what happened. And so when Sharika Adams died on December 14th, and he called his lawyer, and he found out he was going to have to go back to the Charlotte jail. He would not have a trial for a year. He was facing a death penalty in an atmosphere where he felt like everyone in Charlotte had already decided he was guilty. He panicked. He was overwhelmed. And he told everybody who he spoke with that day, his lawyers, his bondsmen, his family, and his friends, everyone. And he called them over and over. He said, I just need time to get my head together. Not, I'm out of here. Not, I can't face this. I just need time to get my head together. He was scared to death, and he acted scared to death. Nothing less than that, but nothing more than that. Now, I've spent about the last hour or so telling you a bunch of things that we intend to show. But let there be no mistake, the fact that we intend to show these things does not change the burden of proof in this case one bit. The burden of proof in this case, no matter what we show or don't show, remains right here. And it remains beyond a reasonable doubt. Mr. Carruth is cloaked with the presumption of innocence. We do not have to prove his innocence to you. In our system, it is the accuser who must prove the accusation, not the accused who must disprove it. That's the way it's worked for over 200 years, and that's the way it needs to continue to work. And as Mr. Cardell mentioned to many of you during the voir dire, it's a heavy burden. It's the heaviest burden that our legal system recognizes. Mr. Cardell used a football field analogy during his voir dire and talked about level playing fields. And, in a civil case with a preponderance, if you look at it as a football field, you get over the 50-yard line, well, now you've got a preponderance. In a criminal case, it's not like that. It's not just getting over the 50 or even getting down into the red zone, the 20 into the goal line. You got to score a touchdown. You got to eliminate from your minds all reasonable doubts. That's what they have to do in order for you to find Rae Carruth guilty of first-degree murder. Now, In order to do that, they're going to have to prove some subsidiary propositions, if you will, beyond a reasonable doubt. For example, they're going to have to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the starting wide receiver for the Carolina Panthers hired a handyman who he had just met and barely knew to serve as his hitman to murder his pregnant girlfriend here in Charlotte. That's one of the things they're going to have to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt. They're going to have to prove to you that he had this plan for 4 or 5 months and discussed it and thought about it, and then suddenly on November 15th, he decides he's going to put it into action, but he doesn't call anybody about getting a car until 7:30 that night. They're going to have to prove to you that the hitman comes to do the hit without his gun, which he has back at his motel. You'll hear that Watkins had a gun back at his motel, but he doesn't bring it to the hit. They're going to have to prove to you that that's what happened, and that as a result of that, Watkins and Kennedy then had to spend the next hour frantically searching for a gun instead of going back to Watkins' motel room to get the gun. They're going to have to prove to you that while all that was going on, Rae Carruth was sitting in the movies not knowing whether they had found a gun or not, and apparently not caring enough to make any calls to see if it was on or not. They're going to have to prove to you that Rae Carruth planned a hit on a night when he took Sharika Adams out in public and was seen with her. That he invited people to his house, like Melvin Billingsley, who saw him with her. That he ran into Hannibal Navies and Hannibal Navies' girlfriend, who saw him with her. And yet, despite that, he plans the hit for that night instead of, for example, the day before when he was in St. Louis at the Rams Stadium in front of 60,000 alibi witnesses. They'll have to prove that to you beyond a reasonable doubt. They will have to prove that he did all of that despite the fact that he participated in the pregnancy, that he bought baby furniture, that he was looking forward to being a father again, and that he had plenty of money. That is what they're going to have to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt to convict Rae Carruth of murder in this case. Members of the jury, at the end of the day, you all will have to decide whether the state has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the shooting of Sharika Adams was a calculated, planned, contract killing. Whether they've proven that beyond a reasonable doubt, or whether it was instead the result of Van Brett Watkins' growing anger and growing frustration and growing rage, which unfortunately exploded. What did Van Brett Watkins himself say that might shed some light on this subject, this critical subject? On December 1st, according to an incident report filed by the Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Office, not by the same deputy, by the way, who wrote the other notes, different deputy. Sharika Adams is fighting for her life. It's December 1st. She's in the hospital. Watkins is coming back from a court appearance. And what he says to the deputy is, and this is in quotes in the report, quote, "I hope the bitch dies." I hope the bitch dies. That's what the state's witness, Van Brett Watkins, said on December 1st. And I ask you all, are those the words of a reluctant contract killer, as Mr. Cardell would have you believe? Or are those the words of someone who acted out of rage and anger, however irrational that rage and anger might have been? We submit to you that the prosecution cannot and will not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Rae Carruth hired Van Brett Watkins to kill Sharika Adams. And because they will not be able to prove that, and because you will, we submit at the end of this case, have much more than just a single reasonable doubt, we will ask you at the end of this case to come back with a verdict of not guilty, as we told you we would, and as each of you committed you could during the voir dire. And we will ask you to come back with that verdict and then walk out of this courtroom with pride, walk into the sunlight with pride at having participated in a process where the truth triumphs over stereotypes and over media images. That's what we will ask you to do at the end of this case, and I have every confidence